Welcome back, everyone. Today we are going to be discussing the history of Adderall. And so we'll talk about amphetamines, how and why they were developed, and we'll also kind of walk ourselves through the history of our understanding of ADHD. And we're actually going to start with the history of ADHD. And we'll start in the late 1700s. So during this time, a Scottish physician, Sir Alexander Crichton, was studying mental health disorders. And he was potentially the first to write about the spectrum of attention as seen in humans. So I'll just go ahead and read this quote. When born with a person, it becomes evident at the very early period of life and has a very bad effect, inasmuch as it renders him incapable of attending with constancy to any one object of education. But it is seldom is in so great a degree as totally to impede all instruction, and what is very fortunate, it is generally diminished with age. So I know that English seems a little bit out of date, it's a little bit awkward to read, but you can see here kind of the understanding that there's something causing a bad effect of attention, and they thought at the time it was generally diminished with age. So that was the understanding of ADHD in the 1700s. As we move forward in time into the 1800s, we'll move to now Germany. The German physician Heinrich Hoffmann potentially was the first to categorize mental disorders as medical issues, so really understanding the illness part of mental illness. He didn't classify them as obsessions or criminality as was kind of previously thought, and at the time, most physicians actually disagreed with the way he thought about these things. He wrote a series of educational books for children describing ADHD-related behaviors, so as we currently understand them, ADHD behaviors. And you can see two of them here on the slide. So Fidgety Philip here is kind of falling from the table with all this stuff kind of crashing down with him, and Johnny Look in the Air, who seems to be kind of stepping off a cliff at this moment. Around the same time, there was a British pediatrician, Sir George Frederick Still, who wrote about what would become ADHD as an abnormal defect of moral control. So certainly some of that wording is kind of blaming the behavior on the person, a defect of moral control. And he was the first person to document the 3-to-1 ratio of male and female incidence of ADHD. So ADHD is diagnosed more often among folks who are born men. It was thought by many to be the starting point of the actual documentation of ADHD. Up until now, people weren't really being diagnosed or documented in this type of way. And some of the symptoms that he described were passionateness, spitefulness and cruelty, jealousy, lawlessness, dishonesty, etc. So a lot of the kind of qualities described with ADHD were just kind of very negative moral behaviors seen at that time. In the 1800s is when amphetamine was first synthesized. My face is covering some of the chemical structure up here, but if you download the slides, you'll be able to see the structure. Its name is derived from a very complicated scientific name, which you don't have to worry about, but I will pronounce it for you now. So alpha-methyl phenethylamine, the capitalization is confusing to my eyeballs. And so amphetamines are all kind of derived from this like basic structure here. Lazar Adderall, a Romanian chemist, was the person to synthesize it, but shortly after this molecule being synthesized, it was kind of lost to history and not kind of studied any further. Now we'll move on to the 1900s next. So now we're kind of classifying ADHD as post-encephalitic behavior disorder. There was kind of now this correlation between some type of brain damage and behavioral issues. There was an epidemic from 1917 to 1928 of encephalitis lethargica. And so folks who survived from this showed some behavioral issues. And physicians were taking a look at this because, from our perspective, kids who had survived this disease were sharing common symptoms with ADHD. In our current understanding, we wouldn't classify it to be ADHD, however. Later in 1968, ADHD was classified as hyperkinetic disease of infancy. And you can see here really the focus on how this is more prevalent at younger ages. Some of the symptoms described very similar to what we currently understand as ADHD. And then ADD, we first see its appearance in 1980. Now let's talk a little bit about early treatment before we jump into the next video, our current, more modern understanding of ADHD. So in the 1900s, there were many breakthroughs in treatment that were kind of just happening by chance. Charles Bradley, a U.S. physician, used a stimulant called Benzedrine on patients after a procedure that caused headaches, thinking that maybe the stimulant would help resolve the headache. However, what he was seeing is it wasn't improving headaches, but it was improving the behavior of his patients that were undergoing this procedure. Now, similar to the discovery of amphetamine, this discovery that this stimulant medication was improving behavior, it didn't take the prevailing belief in the medical field, again, was that these kind of mental illnesses or mental disorders had no biological basis. They were just kind of immorality or just behavioral issues that weren't in any way rooted in biology. So while this discovery occurred and was important, it was ignored mostly. Up next, let's jump to a more modern understanding of ADHD.